Today we are looking at the NKJV Study Bible by Thomas Nelson. This is not a paid review. I don't have any sponsors for the channel, but somebody did send me this. A viewer actually emailed and said, "Have you ever reviewed the New King James Study Bible?" And I said, "No, I haven't, but if you send it to me, I'm happy to do so." They did. So let's get into it. This is the hardback version. It is also available in leather soft, leather-ish, the kind that have thumb index tabs on the side. I can't stand those, by the way, but some people really like them, and no shame if you do. I just don't like them. I don't like pages to be all weird like that. We're going to take this loud dust jacket off. It's very nice. This is the third edition. It's 2,240 pages. The pages are all full color, and it's a 2-column Bible. There's not really much margin room on the top or the sides. The cross-references are down here between the study notes and the text itself. The text is in comfort print font, developed specifically by Thomas Nelson from some Scandinavian font maker that I'm sure other Bible review channels could give you all that information, but I really don't care. The notes, however, are in a slightly different font. All of the pages, when I say they're full color, the keywords that are in the notes are in this burgundy color, and then the chapter numbers are kind of this teal early 90s Honda Civic color. Now, this is a full color Bible, and there are a lot of illustrations, reconstructions, and tons of photos. NKJV Study Bible is laid out beautifully. This is a black letter edition, so the words of Jesus are not going to be printed in red. And the pages are kind of thin. They're very, you can get a little feel for that. There's a little bit of bleeding, a little bit of, I think they call it ghosting, like where you can see an image on the other side of the page. But the font's lined up so that you don't get the font bleeding through when you're trying to read. The pages are thin, but they don't look very thin, in other words. It comes with 2 red ribbons, so you can do Old Testament and New Testament readings and keep track of those. So that's enough of the aesthetics of this Bible, because you guys don't watch this channel for that stuff. Like I said, there are tons of other Bible review channels that nerd out on all of the bindings and the font typesetting, all that stuff. Cool. Go follow those channels. If you're watching this, you probably want to know what's in this Bible. And that's what we're going to talk about. At the beginning in the foreword, there's a list of all of the features that this study Bible contains. Now, each book has a short book introduction, 3 to 4 pages. I would say mid-level in terms of introducing each book. There's a timeline, there's an outline for the book. They discuss things like authorship and date and setting, but they don't go too deep, or at least not as deep as some other comparable study Bibles that we've reviewed before. But they're not shallow, they're not light. It's just, I would say they're kind of solid mid-range. Each introduction also ends with a section called Christ in the Scriptures, which talks about how Jesus is found in that particular book. There are lots of maps in the text, pretty extensive, and they're all full color as well. There are also 80 charts sprinkled throughout, and then there are over 150 of these culture notes. They tell all about different cultural aspects of the text. This one is about tents. There's a picture of a Bedouin tent, what they most likely would have looked like back in the biblical times as well. There's one on clothing. You can actually see what the clothing that people in the times of ancient Israel wore, and how it was actually pretty bright colored. It wasn't like the bathrobes that you see in a lot of Sunday school plays. Actually, some of the bathrobes I've seen do kind of look like this stripy pattern, so maybe those kids are onto something. Now, a great feature of the NKJV Study Bible is there are 350 word studies. They don't actually show you the Hebrew or Greek font, which as a Bible nerd, I kind of like to see, but they do give you the word, its transliteration, key passages where it appears, and it gives you the Strong's number. They're assuming that most readers that would be doing these type of word studies would be using English-based resources like Strong's Concordance. That's a good feature because so many of the words that Scripture uses are significant in the original language, but often get glossed over in English translations. There are also about 100 of these slightly longer articles on different theological topics. So this one is God as Creator. Here's one on righteousness, one on missionary efforts. Now, after the foreword, you come to the list of contributors and editors. And I've got to say, of all the study Bibles that I've reviewed, this is by far the most all over the place in terms of where the contributors are coming from. I mean, you've got people like Bruce Metzger, Tremper Longman, and Michael Bird. But then you also have John Walvoord and Thomas Ice. So when I opened this Bible and started by looking at the contributors, I was a little bit intrigued as to how this thing's going to play out. After that, you come to the abbreviations and then to the preface of the New King James Version. There's an essay at the beginning, right after that, called How to Understand What the Bible Means by What It Says. This is by Earl Radmacher, who's the general editor of this Bible. Radmacher says, central to everything else in this process is the recognition that meaning is singular, not plural. The interpretation is what the writer intended with the vocabulary he used. And then he goes on to lay out a 4-step process of how to interpret a biblical passage, focusing on the word, the relationships of the words to one another, the context, and then the culture. Now, I will come back to this essay at the end of this video when I talk about the NKJV, because he says something that I want viewers to be aware of so that you know, because it could easily slip under the radar, tucked away as it is in this little essay at the front of the Bible, which most people probably won't read. After that essay comes the books of the Old and New Testament, and then a list of all of the articles that you're going to find based on the books that they're in. Then it goes through each of the books and gives you the cultural notes, those background notes that we looked at earlier. Then a list of all the charts and diagrams, a list of all of the maps that are in the text, and then finally a list of all the word studies. After that, you turn the page and you're in the Old Testament. Now, there's no Old Testament introduction essays like there are in other study Bibles. You just jump right to Genesis. However, when you come to the New Testament, there are 2 essays right up front. There's one called Thinking About the Study of the New Testament by D.A. Carson and Doug Moo. And then there's one on the geography of the Gospels by Carl Rasmussen. After that, you have a chart that's a harmony of the Gospels. And then you come to the book Introduction of Matthew. After Revelation, you have standard, the table of weights and measures. Then you have an essay by Tremper Longman and Raymond Dillard called The Bible as History. After that, you have an essay by Michael Bird, What is Theology? Then you have an index of all the teachings and the illustrations of Jesus. Then a few pages of the charts of all of the prophecies of the Messiah fulfilled in Jesus. Then you have an index of the parables of Jesus, an index of the miracles of Jesus, and then an index of prayers of the Bible. After that comes a section that I thought was pretty interesting. It's called From Biblical Book to Contemporary Hook. And basically it lays out every book in the Bible. It gives you the name of the book, the theme of the book, the Christ focus in the book, the implications of that Christ focus in the book, and then it gives you what's called the hook. And this is kind of like if you're a preacher looking for a sermon idea or a question that you can kind of sum up the book's message by. After that, there's the index of all of the subjects and concepts discussed in the notes. And then finally, we come to the concordance. This concordance is nearly 200 pages. It's a thick concordance for a study Bible. It's not a dictionary concordance though, so it doesn't give you definitions of the terms, just where they are in the text. After that, there are 2 blank pages for notes, and then there's a little note at the bottom about the cool font that they use for this Bible, and then come the glossy maps. Now, it doesn't come out and take a specific interpretive approach to Genesis, so it's not going to be a young earth creationist or a theistic evolutionist approach or strictly an old earth view. It doesn't really get into the science questions that Genesis raises, hardly any. I didn't find very much at all about that. There are some subtle hints that you can pick up if you look at some of the notes. The reason I say, for instance, that this allows or kind of leans to sort of a gap theory approach is the study note in chapter 1, verse 2. And it says, the 2 words express one concept, chaos. The earth had been reduced to this state. It was not the way God had first created it. Now that's a very fleeting note. It doesn't unpack it anymore, but that fits with an older interpretation that was more popular in the, say, early to mid 1900s, which is called the gap theory, that states Genesis 1:1 is God creating everything and it being great. And then in between Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 and 1 verse 2, there was this rebellion of the angels and Satan cast down to earth. And so the earth becomes formless and void. This is a uniquely gap theory approach, and I was surprised, honestly, to see it here at the beginning of Genesis. Not heavy-handed, it doesn't dwell on it, but that was interesting to me because most modern study Bibles don't take that approach. It's sort of an antiquated view. However, the notes throughout these opening chapters of Genesis do a good job of noting when there are different interpretations for how something can be. The study notes don't take a hard stance on those questions because they recognize that they are probably have readers from a wide range of interpretive views using this study Bible, which is what every publisher hopes. Now, the reason I say that this leans in an old earth direction at times is because, for instance, the study note of Genesis chapter 10 about the table of nations and the genealogies, it says, finally, the chapters give no clear sense of time. They span many thousands of years. So they're noting you can't just do what Bishop James Ussher and others throughout history have done and just count the genealogies backwards, and then you arrive at a creation date of around 4004 BC. They're saying, no, these are compressed generations. They're representative genealogies. They do not give an exhaustive account. They just get you from this individual to this individual, and there's thousands of years in between. When it comes to the flood, it notes that the language of all the high hills under the whole heaven being covered could be hyperbolic language, but then it goes on to say that the words suggest a flood that covers the whole of the earth. Throughout the notes in the early chapters of Genesis, there was very little recognition of the ancient Near East cultural setting of the text and the motifs that the author of Genesis is pulling from and sort of demythologizing or constructing a polemical theology against. There's really no mention of any of that. Well, it's kind of disappointing because that's really important stuff. There was a good study note about the so-called curse of Ham that many racist Bible interpreters have used throughout the centuries to try to argue that African Americans or black people in general are descended from Ham and therefore cursed by God and are destined to be slaves, yada, yada, yada. It's total garbage. It's not in the text at all. And the note at chapter 9, verse 25, does a great job of pointing that out and saying, no, that's not what was going on at all. This is about Canaan and setting the stage for Israel and the Canaanites. So that was good to see because even to this day, you'll still find that ridiculous theory popping up here and there. When we come to Exodus, the notes are operating under the assumption of the early dating of the Exodus, the 15th century, rather than the later dating, the 13th century. They do note that some people do hold to a 13th century dating, but it's almost like a note in passing. They are really strongly leaning on a 15th century date for the Exodus. Now, there's a good note on page 95 about the hardening of the heart, and it's very, very succinct. But if you've seen our video here on the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, or our superhero seminary video where Professor Grimm explains what it means to have a hardened heart in its Egyptian context, this note succinctly summarizes what we talk about. One thing that surprised me was during the plagues, there's no mention of the gods of Egypt that the plagues were most likely targeting. The only exception is the next to last plague, the darkness. They do note that that would have been interpreted as God showing his sovereignty over Ra, but they don't do that with any of the other plagues, which is a really important thing to point out in the Exodus. So that was disappointing. The note in chapter 12, verse 37 posits that the 600,000 men that came out means that there was likely a population number of 3 million people. Now, even conservative and evangelical interpreters of Exodus do not hold to that high of a number. That's on the high end, even of the most conservative view of Exodus. They didn't have any discussion that there are numerous ways interpreters have approached these numbers and that they are not by any means simply just taken as literal numbers. Now, we've gone deeper into that here at Disciple Dojo when we were teaching through the book of Exodus, so I'll put a link in the video description to where we talk about the numbers and how many Israelites likely were involved in the Exodus. There is brief mention of the Hittite suzerainty covenant treaty format that heavily influences the way we read Exodus and the covenant with Israel, but it's very brief. It's on page 117, not a lot of information on that. I would like to have seen more, but they do mention it. And then there are good illustrations of what the latter chapters of Exodus are presenting, which is the tabernacle and the implements that are used in the tabernacle. And I've said on these reviews before, that's really important. Otherwise, these later chapters of Exodus for modern readers end up just being like reading cookbook directions or IKEA instructions on how to build something, and you just kind of glaze over. So having images that you can look at helps you stay engaged in what you're reading about in the text. Now, when we come to Romans, before the book even begins, there's a whole page with a map of Rome and what was going on in Rome at the time. And then you have about a 4-page introduction to the book itself. When you come to Romans 7, unfortunately, it does take the autobiographical approach that Paul is describing his own ongoing struggle with sin. And it doesn't even really mention the older and I think more accurate approach that in Romans 7, Paul is speaking as one who is not in Christ, who is in Adam and has not experienced what he cries out for at the end of Romans 7, which is that salvation and indwelling of the Holy Spirit. You don't get that. This just takes the view that, nope, in Romans 7, Paul's just talking about his ongoing struggle with sin and that's just what we live with as Christians. I think it's crucial for a good study Bible to present both views, and I was very disappointed that they did not even acknowledge this other view in Romans chapter 7. Now in Romans 8 and 9, where you get into questions of predestination, this is where they do present both views. And an Arminian and a Calvinist reading the notes in these sections would be, I think, okay with them. They would obviously want them to take their side more, but the study notes overall, when it comes to the issue of election, they don't take a hard Arminian or a hard Calvinist stance. And that is commendable. So bad job on Romans 7, good job on Romans 8 and 9. Then when we come to chapter 11 and the question of who is all Israel and all Israel will be saved, it takes a pretty standard futurist reading that all Israel refers to some point in the future when the majority of ethnic Israelites, ethnic Jews, will come to faith in Jesus. But it does note that this doesn't mean every single Israelite. That's a passage where Christians are also strongly divided, and it would have been nice to see them deal with the other view of Romans 11, that the all Israel is Jew and Gentile together in Christ, one olive tree, all Israel. But they don't. Finally, when we come to Revelation, this is the one I was braced for. I was expecting some strong pre-trib dispensational heavy-handed notes, and you don't get that, surprisingly. They take the view that Revelation was written by John the Apostle, though they do note that it could have been another elder named John. And they also note that some people think Revelation was written before the destruction of the temple, but then they lean to the mid-90s date for Revelation being written, which is probably the majority opinion among scholars. Now, in the introduction, there is no discussion of apocalyptic literature or the type of imagery or symbolism, which I was surprised by because that's, what you need to know before you start reading an apocalyptic book. And I was getting ready to lay into them in this review as I was preparing. But then I found on page 1950, they did a whole article on apocalyptic. And on page 1953, they did a whole article on the different views of Revelation, including the different views of those who hold to a rapture. So they really did cover all the bases. So good job on that. Now, if you watch Disciple Dojo Study Bible reviews, you know that the case study I always go to in Revelation for seeing how they handle background information is the church at Laodicea. And lo and behold, they got the interpretation of the church at Laodicea right. They note that hot and cold are both good. It's lukewarm that's bad. But they didn't give the historic background, the reason why that image was used. The whole hot water and cold water thing, completely glossed over that. And in none of the other letters to the churches did they really get into the background of the imagery used in those letters either. Overall, their approach to Revelation, they lean to a futurist approach. So they would take all of the events of Revelation, as well as the Olivet Discourse back in the Gospels. They just assume that he's talking about the end of the world, rather than a more preterist approach that he's talking about the end of their world, that is Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. Regardless, there are many interpretations, and they do list the different interpretations, but the notes are going to lean to a futurist reading. So if you're a premillennial, you'll probably be the most comfortable with these notes. If you're amillennial or postmillennial, they probably won't resonate with you quite as much. If you're dispensational, you'll be okay with them, but you'll want more dispensational stuff because they don't push a dispensationalist approach. That's probably the best way I could think to summarize how they handle Revelation. In the Song of Songs, Song of Solomon, they take it as a story about Solomon and one of his brides. That was disappointing. That is by no means a universal view, and it's one that I don't hold to. If you want to know more on that, I'll put a link in the description to another video series here at Disciple Dojo where we've looked at the imagery of the Song of Songs and what it means and how it should be interpreted. I also looked at the passages that are typically brought up in the complementarian egalitarian debate to see where this study Bible lands, and I think it's fair to say the NKJV Study Bible leans complementarian. It's not as complementarian as something like, say, the ESV Study Bible, but it's also not egalitarian like the NLT Study Bible. It does lean complementarian. I don't want to give the impression that it doesn't, but not in a heavy-handed way. Now, I said I'd come back to the essay at the beginning by Radmacher on how to interpret the Bible because it has to do with my thoughts on the New King James as a translation, and this is what I mean. In his essay, he says, it may be worthwhile to suggest two tools that will be helpful to the student of Scripture in the first step. Number one, the majority text Greek New Testament interlinear. This work interweaves the English translation and the Greek text so that the student can see what Greek words translate into the English rendering. Now, this is what I want to make sure doesn't go unnoticed. When he recommends the majority text Greek New Testament interlinear, that is not the Greek text that most other translations use. The majority text, that is the Greek text that was available at the time of the King James translation, but since then, in those hundreds of years, older manuscripts have been found. Text criticism of the New Testament has improved. If you don't know anything about this, check out our video here at Disciple Dojo about mistaken manuscripts. I'll put a link in the description. We talk all about it. But basically, the New King James Version is an update of the King James Version. And the King James Version, New Testament, is based on the known manuscripts at the time of the King James translation. That's why you are going to find things, words, phrases, sometimes even whole verses or sections that are in the King James New Testament that are not in other modern English translations. And it's not because anybody took anything out of the Bible. It's because when older and more reliable manuscripts were found in those 400 years between the King James Version and modern translations, those older manuscripts, which took us closer to the original text, did not contain many of these additions, many of these scribal notations, many of these traditions that got introduced into the text. So the majority text is the Greek New Testament that the King James translators were working from. And for the most part, it's fine. It's not like it's heresy. It's not like you're going to have crazy stuff in there. But in terms of New Testament scholarship, it's not the most accurate Greek text. It's not the Greek text that's the closest to what the original authors would have written. For that, you would need to look at some of the critical editions of the Greek New Testament. The Nestle Allen 28th edition, the United Bible Society's 5th edition. There are other ones out there, but they all take into account these manuscripts that have been found in those hundreds of years since the King James was produced. So them telling you to use the majority text to see what the Greek says without telling you what the majority text is and why it's different from all the other critical editions of the Greek New Testament, to me, I wouldn't say it's dishonest, but it's disappointing. And that's my critique of the NKJV as a translation. It updates the King James. So some of the archaic words, some of the false friends, as Mark Ward puts it over on his channel, those words that used to mean one thing when the King James was translated in English, and now they have a different meaning in modern English, and so therefore the verse can be misread by a modern reader. The New King James does update a lot of those things, and that's good. But in doing so, not only does it take away kind of the literary artistry that makes the King James what it is, it's still the same manuscripts that the King James translators used. So the Greek text that the New King James is translating isn't the most accurate Greek text in the eyes of the majority of faithful, godly New Testament scholars. So this is kind of a tempest in a teapot. Is it going to lead anybody astray if they read the New King James? No. Is it a good translation? Yes. Can you do good Bible study using the New King James? Absolutely. But is it the best representation of the original wording? No. And at the end of the day, I have to agree with Doug Stewart and Gordon Fee in their book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, about the New King James. They say, recognizing that the English of the KJV was no longer a living language and thoroughly dissatisfied with its modern revisions, the RSV and the NRSV, it was decided by some to update the KJV by ridding it of its archaic way of speaking. But in doing so, the NKJV revisers eliminated the best feature of the KJV, its marvelous expression of the English language, and kept the worst, its flawed text. This is why, for study, you should use almost any modern translation rather than the KJV or NKJV. I agree. I don't think the NKJV is horrible, and Stewart and Fee wouldn't say that either, but it is not the first translation I reach for. I'm not anti New King James, I'm not the opposite of a KJV only person, like a KJV never person. I just think that in terms of studying, especially the Greek text, you're not studying the best and most accurate representation of the Greek text if you're studying from the NKJV or the KJV. That being said, again, 99.9% of the time it doesn't matter. So for your reading and your devotion, if you like the New King James, I have friends and ministry colleagues who love the New King James. They like its format. They like the way it handles passages. They like that it's kind of familiar to the King James they grew up with, but it's also understandable by a modern reader. Cool. If you like the New King James, this would be a good study Bible for you to use, a good general study Bible. This would not be my first choice in study Bibles for translation reasons and for reasons of content, but it's not bad by any means. And in fact, I will keep this one on the shelf and look at the notes and how they handle different passages from time to time. So those are my thoughts on the NKJV 3rd edition study Bible by Thomas Nelson Publishers. What are your thoughts? Feel free to share your comments in the comment section below. And if you have a study Bible that you would like me to review, go over to Disciple Dojo's website and fill out the contact form. I can't run out and buy a bunch of study Bibles just because people ask me to review them, but certainly if you send me one, I'm happy to look at it and share my thoughts with you. And if I think it would make for a good video, then I'll certainly review it here on the channel. That's it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time back here at Disciple Dojo.